Part 1. Introduction. Long ago, in the 14th century, England was a land of small villages, muddy roads, and simple lives. Most people were farmers. They worked the same fields their parents had worked, and their grandparents before them. Life was hard, but it had a kind of rhythm to it. The seasons came and went. Harvests were celebrated. People had known disease before, of course. Fevers, plagues, and sickness were part of life in the Middle Ages. But nothing could have prepared them for what was coming. From somewhere far away, carried along the great trading routes of the world, something was moving. Silently, invisibly. It crept from city to city, from port to port, across mountains and seas. And in the year 1348, it arrived on the shores of England. What followed would change the country forever. This is the story of the Black Death. To understand how the plague came to England, we need to go back a little further, back to the warm lands of Central Asia, where, sometime in the early 1340s, something terrible began. Scientists today believe the plague started in the region around Central Asia, possibly modern-day Kyrgyzstan. There is even a burial ground there, dating to 1346, where grave markers mention a mysterious, deadly sickness. The disease was caused by a tiny bacterium. So small it couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Its name, which we know today, is Yersinia pestis. But of course, the people of the 14th century had no idea such a thing existed. They had no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria, no concept of germs. What they did know was that rats were everywhere. In the grain stores, in the alleyways, on the ships. And on those rats lived fleas. Tiny, biting fleas. And it was the fleas that carried the plague from creature to creature, and eventually, to human beings. When an infected flea bit a person, the bacteria entered the bloodstream. And once inside the body, it began to spread. The plague moved westward along the Silk Road, the great trade route connecting Asia to Europe. Merchants, soldiers, and travelers unknowingly carried it with them. By 1346, it had reached the northern shores of the Black Sea. By 1347, it had spread to the Mediterranean. Sicily, Italy, France, and Spain fell one by one. And then it crossed the Channel. Part 2. The plague arrives in England. It is believed that the Black Death first arrived in England in the summer of 1348. Most historians point to the port of Melcombe Regis, in Dorset, on the south coast. A ship arrived there, likely from France, carrying sailors who were already sick. Within days, people in the town began to fall ill. The symptoms were unmistakable and terrifying. It usually began with a fever. A sudden, burning heat that came on without warning. Then came the swellings. Painful lumps, sometimes the size of an egg, appear in the armpits, the groin, or the neck. These were called buboes, and it is from this word that we get the name, the bubonic plague. The skin around the buboes would darken, turn black or deep purple. The person would suffer terrible pain. They would vomit. They might bleed beneath the skin, leaving dark blotches across the body. Some accounts describe a dreadful smell. Others mention a kind of madness that came before the end. Most people who caught the disease died within a few days. Sometimes, just 2 or 3 days after the first signs appeared. The speed of it was one of the most frightening things. A person could be walking about in the morning, and dead by evening. There were actually 3 forms of the plague. The first, and most common, was the bubonic plague, spread by flea bites. The second was the septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. This form killed even faster. A person might die before the buboes even had time to form. The third form was the most feared of all. The pneumonic plague. This version attacked the lungs. It could be spread through the air, through coughs and breath. If someone with pneumonic plague coughed near you, you could catch it. There was almost no chance of surviving this form. It killed virtually everyone it touched. From Dorset, the plague spread quickly. It moved eastward along the coast and northward through the countryside. By the autumn of 1348, it had reached London. London at this time was a crowded, bustling city of perhaps 80,000 people. The streets were narrow. Rubbish piled up. Animals wandered freely. The River Thames, which ran through the heart of the city, was used for everything from drinking water to waste. It was, in other words, the perfect place for a plague to thrive. The disease tore through London over the winter of 1348 and into 1349. Church records from this period show burial after burial after burial. Cemeteries filled so quickly that new ones had to be dug. One in Smithfield, known as the New Church Whore, was said to hold over 10,000 bodies. Part 3. The spread across England. By the spring of 1349, the plague had spread far beyond London. It moved into the home counties, then into the Midlands. It crept northward into Yorkshire and Lancashire. It crossed into Wales. It swept through Bristol, one of England's busiest ports, and then into the surrounding counties. No town was too small to escape it. No village too remote. There is a well-known story from the village of Eyam in Derbyshire. That particular outbreak came later, in 1665, during a second great wave of plague. But it gives us a sense of what communities throughout England must have faced in those earlier years. An entire village trapped in the path of an invisible killer, watching their neighbours die one by one. In 1348 and 49, similar scenes played out across the whole country. Priests struggled to keep up with the dying. Some priests themselves fell ill and died, leaving parishes without anyone to offer last rites. Monks and friars, who often cared for the sick, were particularly vulnerable. Several monasteries lost more than half their members. The farming villages were hit hard, too. When farmers died, fields went unploughed. Livestock wandered untended. Harvests rotted in the ground. In some areas, entire villages were simply abandoned. The people were either dead or had fled. Even the animals seemed to suffer. Cattle, sheep, and pigs died in large numbers, either from related diseases or from simple neglect. One chronicler, a monk named Henry Knighton, wrote that sheep lay dead in the fields in their thousands, with no one left to move them. The plague reached the north of England by the spring and summer of 1349. Scotland, which had at first mocked the English for their suffering, calling it God's revenge, was itself struck down later that same year. Ireland, too, felt the full force of it. By the time the first great wave began to ease, sometime around 1350, England had been utterly transformed. Now we come to the question that haunts historians even today. How many people died? The honest answer is that we cannot know for certain. Record-keeping in the 14th century was nothing like what we have today. Many records were lost or destroyed. Many communities had no written records at all. But from the records that do survive, including church registers, tax documents, and monastic accounts, historians have tried to piece together an estimate. The most widely accepted figure is that somewhere between 30 and 60% of England's population died during the Black Death. Some areas suffered even more. Some estimates suggest that certain towns and villages lost as many as 2/3 of their people. Before the plague, England's population was somewhere around 4 to 6 million people. By the time the first wave was over, it may have fallen by as much as half. Think about that for a moment. In the space of just 2 or 3 years, perhaps 2 million people in England alone had died. And across Europe as a whole, the death toll was staggering. It is estimated that between 75 and 200 million people died worldwide. Europe may have lost as much as 1/3 to a half of its entire population. It was the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. Part 4. How people understood and treated the plague. We have to remember something important when we think about how people responded to the Black Death. They did not understand what was causing it. There was no germ theory, no microscopes, no public health agencies. The people of medieval England looked for explanations in the world they knew. And the world they knew was shaped by faith, tradition, and a deep belief that illness was connected to sin. Many people believed the plague was a punishment from God, a divine judgment upon humanity for its wickedness. The Church encouraged this idea. Priests preached that people must repent, confess their sins, pray for mercy. Others looked to the stars. Astrology was taken seriously in the 14th century, even by educated people. Some scholars blamed a particular alignment of the planets, suggesting that a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the year 1345 had corrupted the air. And it was the air that most people believed was the main carrier of disease. The idea of miasma, or bad air, was widely accepted. If the air smelled bad, it was thought to be dangerous. This is why people held flowers or herbs to their noses when passing through plague-ridden areas, or burned strong-smelling wood in their homes. Sadly, of course, none of this made any difference. Jewish communities were, tragically, blamed in some parts of Europe. In Germany and other countries, horrific violence was carried out against Jewish people, accused of poisoning wells. In England, this particular form of persecution was less extreme, but Jews had already been expelled from the country in 1290, decades before the plague arrived. Some people sought answers in extreme religious devotion. In parts of Europe, groups called flagellants traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as a form of penance, hoping to appease God. This practice was less common in England than on the continent, but it reflects the desperation people felt. So what did doctors and healers actually do? Medicine in the 14th century was based largely on ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly the work of a physician named Galen. The dominant theory was that the body was governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to result from an imbalance of these humours. Treatments, therefore, were aimed at restoring balance. One of the most common was bloodletting, cutting the patient and allowing blood to flow out, to reduce what was seen as an excess. Needless to say, this weakened the patient further. It almost certainly made things worse. Lancing the buboes was another treatment. The swollen lumps would be cut open, drained, and sometimes cauterized with a hot iron. This was excruciatingly painful. In a small number of cases, it may have helped, but for most, it was too late. Herbal remedies were also used. Vinegar, rosemary, and various plant-based concoctions were recommended. People were told to eat moderately, avoid baths, which were thought to open the pores to bad air, and to flee to cleaner air if they could. Fleeing was, in fact, one of the more practical responses. Those wealthy enough to leave the cities did so. Some retreated to country estates. Some simply wandered, hoping to outrun the sickness. Unfortunately, many unknowingly carried it with them wherever they went. Quarantine was beginning to be used in some Mediterranean cities by this time. Venice and other Italian ports began requiring ships to wait offshore for a period of 30 days, later extended to 40, before passengers could come ashore. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian word for 40. But these measures came too late for much of Europe, and England had no such system in place. Part 5. Life during the plague. What was it like to live through the Black Death in England? The chronicles and records that survive paint a picture of profound fear and social disruption. Ordinary life, the rhythms and routines that people depended on, simply broke down. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a contemporary writer, possibly a priest or monk, who described how the sick were abandoned by their families. How people refused to visit the dying, even their own parents or children, for fear of catching the disease themselves. How bodies lay unburied in the streets. How dogs and rats gnawed at the dead. This was not universal, of course. Many people showed extraordinary courage and compassion. Priests who knew they were likely to die continued to visit the sick. Neighbors cared for neighbors. Families stayed together even when it put them at risk. But the social fabric was stretched to breaking point. The economic disruption was severe. Craftsmen died. Merchants died. Lawyers, judges, and government officials died. Even King Edward III's daughter, Princess Joan, died of the plague in 1348, while travelling to Spain for her wedding. No one was truly safe. Though it does seem that the poor suffered more than the wealthy. The poor lived in more crowded conditions, had less food, and had weaker bodies due to malnutrition. They could not afford to flee. And they could not avoid the rats and fleas that thrived in their homes. The church was hit particularly hard. Priests and monks who ministered to the sick were constantly exposed to the disease. Hundreds of clergy died. In some dioceses, the number of priests fell so dramatically that new, younger priests had to be hurriedly ordained, sometimes with little training. This had long-lasting effects on the quality of religious life in England. For ordinary people, one of the most disturbing aspects of the plague was the religious uncertainty it created. The Church taught that a good death meant receiving last rites, confessing sins, and being properly buried in consecrated ground. But the plague made all of this nearly impossible. People died too quickly. Priests were unavailable or dead themselves. Cemeteries were full. What happened to the souls of those who died without last rites? This question haunted survivors deeply. And then, after 2 years of terror, the worst of it began to ease. By 1350, the first great wave of the Black Death had passed. Not because anyone had found a cure. Not because the authorities had stopped it. But simply because it had run out of people to infect. Or perhaps because the seasons changed, and the fleas that carried it became less active in the cold. England emerged from the plague like a person waking from a nightmare, dazed, diminished, but still alive. Part 6, The Aftermath and Legacy. The years that followed the Black Death were strange and difficult ones in England. With so many people dead, there were simply not enough workers to go around. This might sound like an odd thing to say in the aftermath of such a catastrophe, but it had profound consequences. Before the plague, England had a system called feudalism. Under this system, peasants, known as serfs or villeins, were bound to the land of a lord. They had to work for that lord, pay him rents, and do as he commanded. In return, they received protection and the right to farm a small plot of land. It was a system of deep inequality, and it had been in place for hundreds of years. After the plague, everything changed. With so many people dead, lords found themselves desperately short of workers. And the surviving peasants knew it. For the first time, they could demand better wages. They could move to a different lord if one treated them badly. They had, in a grim and terrible way, gained a kind of power. The ruling classes tried to resist this. In 1349, King Edward III issued the Statute of Labourers, a law that tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving freely. But it was difficult to enforce. People simply ignored it. Tensions between peasants and landowners grew throughout the second half of the 14th century. Eventually, these tensions boiled over into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, one of the most significant uprisings in English history. While the revolt had many causes, the social changes set in motion by the Black Death were among the most important. The plague also changed the landscape of England in more literal ways. Many villages that had been weakened by the plague were simply abandoned in the years that followed. Historians call these deserted medieval villages. There are hundreds of them across England. In some places, you can still see the faint outlines of their streets and buildings in the grass. The Black Death did not arrive just once, either. It returned. Again and again over the following centuries. There were major outbreaks in England in 1361, 1369, and 1375. Each time it came back, it killed again, though never quite with the ferocity of that first terrible wave. Later outbreaks continued well into the 17th century. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was one of the last major outbreaks in England. That year alone, nearly 100,000 people died in London, almost a quarter of the city's population. After 1665, the plague gradually retreated from England, for reasons historians and scientists still debate. Better building standards that reduced rat populations. Changes in the rat species present in England. Improved public health measures. Perhaps simply a shift in the nature of the disease itself. But by then, the plague had left its mark on the English language, on English culture, and on the English soul. Art from this period became preoccupied with death. Images of skeletons dancing with the living, known as the Dance of Death, appeared on church walls across England and Europe. The message was clear. Death comes for everyone, rich and poor, young and old, priest and king alike. Literature changed, too. Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales in the years following the plague, lived through the later outbreaks. His stories are full of life, of humour, of sharp observation. But underneath them runs a darker current, an awareness of how quickly life can be taken away. Even the English language carries traces of those dark years. The phrase "ring a ring of roses," which many people know as a children's rhyme, has sometimes been claimed to refer to the plague. Though most scholars today are skeptical of that particular connection, it shows how deeply the memory of the Black Death has embedded itself in the popular imagination. Part 7. What we know today. Modern science has given us a much clearer picture of the Black Death and what caused it. We know now that the bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, was primarily spread through the bites of fleas that lived on rats and other small rodents. When the rat population of a particular area was devastated by the disease, the fleas would seek out other hosts, including human beings. The bubonic form of the plague was the most common, spread by flea bites. But the pneumonic form, which spread through the air, was almost certainly responsible for some of the fastest and most devastating outbreaks, particularly in crowded cities where people lived close together. Recent genetic research has allowed scientists to extract DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in medieval cemeteries. These studies have confirmed that the bacterium responsible for the Black Death was indeed Yersinia pestis, and that the strain from the 14th century was closely related to strains that still exist in wild rodent populations today. The plague is not gone, even now. Cases of bubonic plague still occur in parts of the world, including the American West, parts of Africa, and Central Asia. But modern antibiotics can treat it effectively if caught early. What was once a death sentence is now, in most cases, curable. Historians continue to debate some aspects of the Black Death. In recent years, some researchers have suggested that the death toll might have been even higher than traditional estimates. New analysis of pollen records, tax documents, and archaeological data from across Europe has led some scholars to suggest that the plague may have killed closer to 60% of Europe's population, rather than the commonly cited figure of 1/3 to 1/2. There has also been debate about whether other factors played a role alongside the bacterium. A series of terrible famines had struck England and much of Europe in the years immediately before the plague, between 1315 and 1322, a period known as the Great Famine. These famines had weakened the population, making people more vulnerable to disease. The climate was also changing during this period, with a cooling trend known as the Little Ice Age bringing harsher winters and failed harvests. So the Black Death did not strike a healthy, thriving population. It struck one who was already under severe stress. And yet, England survived. The people who lived through those terrible years rebuilt their communities, their churches, their towns. They mourned their dead. They adapted. They endured. In the generations that followed, English society was transformed in ways that the plague had set in motion. A more mobile workforce. A weakening of the old feudal order. The slow, uneven beginnings of what we might call a more modern world. There is something both humbling and remarkable about that. The Black Death was an event of almost incomprehensible scale. A catastrophe that touched virtually every corner of the country, every family, every community. And yet life continued. The fields were planted again. The churches filled again. Children were born and grew up in a world that had been, in some ways, remade by disaster. History has a way of doing that. Of showing us both the depths of human suffering and the extraordinary persistence of human life. Part 8. Closing reflection. We live today in a world very different from medieval England. We have hospitals, medicines, and scientists who can identify a new pathogen within days. We have quarantine systems, vaccines, and global health organizations. We have seen, in our own time, what a pandemic can do to a modern world. And we have seen, too, how much more capable we are of responding. And yet there are things about the Black Death that still feel very close. The fear. The uncertainty. The desperate search for explanations. The way that disease reveals the cracks and inequalities in a society. The people who show extraordinary courage in the face of it, and the people who are overwhelmed. The grief. The 14th century men and women who walked through plague-stricken villages, who dug graves for their neighbors, who sat with their dying children, who prayed in empty churches, were not so different from us. They loved their families. They worried about the future. They hoped that tomorrow would be better than today. And for many of them, eventually, it was. The Black Death lasted, in its most intense first wave, from 1348 to around 1350 in England. But its effects echoed for centuries. It changed the population, the economy, the social structure, and the culture of the country in ways that historians are still exploring today. It remains, by any measure, one of the most significant events in English history. A dividing line between the world that came before and the world that came after. And the story of those who lived through it, those ordinary, frightened, resilient, human beings, is worth remembering. Thank you for listening. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. There is so much more history to explore, and so many more stories to tell. Until next time, take care.